Good morning, world. Cedric and I are out here on another beautiful day in Southern California. Today we thought we'd tackle a different type of subject.
Yes, absolutely right. We're going to tackle the topic of racism. I'm Cedric.
And I'm Brian, and this is Cedric and Brian.
Okay, if you're wondering why Brian and I chose this topic, it's just something that's been running through our minds for a number of years. If you don't know, we've been friends for 20 years, and we really don't think about the whole concept of race until someone else brings it up. And then we kind of look at each other like, oh my God, we are different. But our friendship's kind of washed over that. But I thought it'd be kind of cool to talk about racism because in my situation, being a black male, blacks only comprise about 12.5% of the entire population.
And then my mother is Jewish, so I was raised kind of in a mixed thing. My father's not Jewish. We just did a lot of the Jewish type things, going to bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, Jewish wedding, things like that. So I did have that culture in my upbringing.
You brought up an interesting point yesterday when we were talking about this. You said, and I learned something. You said that growing up Jewish, it's decided by the mom.
Yeah, so, and that I didn't know till later, and we can get into that later, but you, in the Jewish faith, whatever your mother is, that's what you are. So, you know, whether that's, and we're not talking as a religion, we're talking basically as a race, if you say, or a people. We're going to start off, we're going to take this kind of chronologically. So I'm going to ask Cedric some questions, he'll ask me some questions, you'll just be part of the conversation. And like most of our conversations, we'd love to have your feedback in the comments. And please leave them in the comments of YouTube. We love that you leave them in Facebook and Instagram and all that, but YouTube is really where we go to for our comments for our YouTube content.
I think I did. I don't think I was really aware of it. I was very fortunate. Both my parents, my mom being from Alabama and my dad being from Mississippi, grew up during the time of segregation and things like that. They moved out here to California, where there's a lot of opportunity. But I was fortunate to grow up in West LA, a huge melting pot. I was maybe 6 miles from the Wilshire district, which is where 3rd Street Marketplace, the market is. And if I went 8 miles east, I could have been in South Central. And if I went 8 miles west, I was in Santa Monica, Brentwood, Wilshire. And all my friends comprised of different people from that area. So I wasn't really isolated with a single group of people. All my friends came from different types of backgrounds, different type of cultures, different type of experiences. So I really didn't experience a whole lot of racism because all my friends were white, they were black, they were Hispanic. So I thought that's just the way the world was.
Was there a lot of minorities in your school? Or was it rare? Was it a mainly white school? What was the melting? What was the mixture?
It was a predominantly white school. I went to a private school in Culver City, predominantly white school. And there was a few black kids there, some Hispanic kids, but really we didn't talk about it. Sports racism. And by that I meant when going to playing basketball. And I don't know how this was brought up into my mind. I just kind of adopted it. Like if we walked into a gym, we saw a predominantly white team. Right away without even saying it, I thought, okay, they're going to be well coached. They're going to shoot well from the outside.
Well, that was racist.
Yeah, right. And they're going to pass a lot. They're going to set a lot of picks, things like that. Contrary, if I walked in and saw a predominantly black team, I was like, they're going to be fast. They're going to trap us. They're going to be jumping over our heads. It was sports racism.
Okay.
You wonder where I get some of my obscure humor from. I get it from my father. He and I can laugh about everything and nothing at the exact same time. But we were, like a lot of black people my age, we were brought up on one primary comedian, and that was Richard Pryor. If you never listened to Richard Pryor, I am not saying that you should. Maybe you should. He's some pretty. Most comedians will tell you nowadays he is undeniably the king of comedy. But Richard Pryor, he talked a lot about the black experience, growing up black, so I could relate to that and things like that. Yeah. So it was, like you said, it was funny, little graphic and some descriptions and stuff, but funny nonetheless.
Well, it's funny because you mentioned that since growing up when I was younger, so you basically watch what your parents watch. So my mom was the one, her side of the family, so you talk about Richard Pryor, she watched a lot of the shows that had all of the Jewish comedians of the time. And in her time, a lot of the comedians were Jewish.
Right.
So that was what I was brought up with way before some of the more contemporary when we were in high school comedians. So, all of the comedians and Three Stooges.
Right.
And that's what I sat as a little kid. I didn't realize later, and then she told me, they were all Jewish. So I did see a lot of Jewish comedians.
Right.
Growing up, and that was the only real thing I knew. So when I was in elementary school, I really didn't know because the color of my skin was the same as most all the kids.
Right.
So, at a certain point, you don't know that there's any difference. Whereas somebody who's going to be racist, it's going to be racist. They'll know that you're
Right.
black.
Right.
Somebody who may not like Jews wouldn't know. I was a little towhead. I had blonde hair and blue eyes.
Yeah.
I wasn't your stereotypical Jew anyway.
Right.
So I didn't experience direct racism because most people didn't know
Right.
I was Jewish. That didn't happen until later.
Right. And we've become a lot more sensitive, I can say, as years have gone on, because I think you and I have talked about this in our private conversations, growing up, some of the things I've watched on TV, like the Jeffersons and Good Times. And I know you were completely shocked and flabbergasted when I told you that my dad's favorite show of all time was All in the Family, starring Archie Bunker. And Brian was like, what? And my parents, and I think a lot of black households just loved All in the Family. There was no hiding anything. Things were pointed. They said things straight out, things that could never be put on TV.
Yeah.
Nowadays.
I know. That's, especially with comedy, since we're talking about comedy, everybody was fair game.
Right.
And in fact, speaking of Jewish comedians, Don Rickles. I mean, there wasn't a person that he left, and same with Richard Pryor. I mean, they weren't afraid to go after people, whereas if you had an Archie Bunker now, they would be banned from the airwaves, and it's...
Yeah, and then you're not allowed to host the Oscars or whatever show's coming up because you say something, you're responsible. But I mean, and I got very used very quickly, either good, bad, or indifferent, and I'll talk about that later on, is that certain things were said that I just didn't take offense to. Watching the Jeffersons and watching Good Times, you heard words that were considered derogatory today, like honky and cracker. And one thing that I can say that Brian can't say, and this is just for educational purposes, the word nigger was thrown out and no one batted an eye. As a matter of fact, that could be an entirely different show altogether, talking about the use of that within the black.
Yeah, I was going to say, now to me, it's used more now in popular music that I ever heard, because some of those words you talked about was on with Archie Bunker, but I never heard the N word really on there. But I heard a lot of other stuff. I heard honky, cracker, and then obviously he would make stereotypical things that he sent me, which was crazy.
Our world is coming crumbling down. The coons are coming.
It'd been so long, and it was about watermelon.
12% of the population is black. There should be a lot of black families living out here.
Yeah, this is only a beginning, but I think it's wonderful.
Wonderful, huh? Well, let's see how wonderful it is when a watermelon rinds come flying out the window.
And all that stuff. And
The only people nowadays can afford living help are rich people and Jews.
that was allowed to be said, but I still never really heard the N-word, except for Richard Pryor.
And that's how Richard Pryor was huge.
Yeah,
and
so...
Red Fox and Saffron and Son. I mean, he watered down, said Negro and things like that,
yeah,
but it wasn't... you didn't bat an eye. You laughed about it because that was just part of the lexicon of those days in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yeah. Did you start experiencing people in a negative way, not in a comedic way, but using the N-word?
And it's weird because you talk about that because you talk about the impact of words and how they affect you and how you can say something to one that sticks with you forever, even if you're like 7 or 8 years old. And I've heard people who are like in their 70s and 80s who remember something they were called back in middle school and they think it's still stuck with them. It was after school one day. We were out in the playground. I think we were playing baseball, and I remember this distinctly. I was up to bat and on the playground, and then we were very close. My Culver City is next to Venice Beach, Santa Monica, and 2 teenage boys rode by on their beach cruisers, and I'm standing up and I'm up to bat, and they walked by, and I heard the hawk of I call it a loogie, I guess, hawk of a loogie, like, and heard it come out, and they rolled by, and the guy in the front just looked at me and said, "Nigger." And I remember thinking, like, well, he's talking to me. And that was the first time that, like, just...
How old were you?
Oh, gee, how old are you in the 7th?
Oh, you're 7th grade?
7th.
Okay,
eighth
so
grade,
like
yeah.
middle school?
Middle school,
Okay.
things like that. And that was the first time... Now, here's the thing, though. Good, bad, or indifferent. My dad and my uncles, and I'm not going to get into the whole week. Like I said, it could be another 2-hour discussion about how that word ends, if it ends in a G-A or ends in a hard E-R. I'm not going to get into all that. But it was a term that was used around the household a lot, but that hard, for some reason, it was weird. It shouldn't have. That hard ER hit me. And I was like, and it kind of like, the fact that I can remember to this day.
Yeah.
It hit me hard.
Well, because you knew it was used in a derogatory way. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he's watching this. Alan Hatari, he was the gentleman who was like he watched over us after school and stuff, and he came to me and said, you know what, worry about those guys, they're idiots. White guy. Alan, loved Alan to this day. He said, don't worry about those guys are idiots. And I honestly think the look on Alan's face was like, had those guys not been on beach cruisers and been riding at such a high pace, I think he would have gone after them.
Yeah.
Which and that showed me a lot. It's like I couldn't let what those two individuals call me have a negative attitude toward Alan.
Right.
Because that's Alan and that's them and that's what they decide to say.
Huh.
That was my experience with it. Have you had any experience with that? Being called out of your name?
No, not. I mean, obviously, because I look the way I do, nobody's gonna, look at me and call me a derogatory name. But I have a different experience because
I've called you ugly.
Well, yeah, that's thanks. So up through elementary school, I really didn't know any different, and then people didn't know. I didn't advertise, that I had, that my mom was Jewish or anything.
Right.
Junior high, though. So junior high is where, kids start to, become more racist, I guess. I mean, people start to separate. As little kids, everybody just plays. You don't learn racism. It seems like you learn it later.
Right.
So I would hear things where people would say things because since they didn't know that I was Jewish, I would hear things like, "Oh, he really Jewed me down," and I was like, "Well, what does that mean?"
Right.
And then I learned, that means that they think that all Jews are cheap. I'm going to Jew them down, or they would say like a Jewish joke in a very negative way, or use terms like hook nose, not knowing that I was Jewish. So people would say racist things right to me because they didn't have any idea.
Right, because you didn't fit the mode.
Yeah, I fit the mode. I couldn't wear my race like you did.
Right.
For better or for worse, obviously I'm not going to experience the type of racism that you are because I don't look a certain way.
Right.
But I think because of that, as time went on, so in junior high there was a kid, his name's Danny McKibben. And like you said, you'll never forget those two guys calling you that. Danny McKibben, he found out I was Jewish, or my mom was Jewish, and this kid was like a Nazi. I mean, at a young age, and so it must have been his upbringing, he was a full-on Nazi. So he found out that it was my mom that was Jewish, and he said, I'm going to stand out in front of your house, and I'm going to start throwing rocks at your mom. And I'm just like, I'm a kid. I'm just a junior high kid, and he was older than me. I was like, what the heck? So that was my first thing. It's like, oh my God, there's some bad people out here that don't like you just because of where you come from or who you are. That was my first experience of, wow, people have hatred. Up to that point, I didn't experience it because like I said, I could hide it. But as soon as he said that, now it went from people just saying, I'm going to Jew you down, not knowing I was Jewish, to somebody who knew that I was Jewish, who in my face told me how he wanted to kill my mom. So that was my first experience, and then around the same time, I had a teacher, and I may use a clip from our friend B,
Yes.
who sent a great clip on this point in time in our lives. I think it was through junior high, of a teacher we had who was also a Nazi, neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call it. And I will let B tell you something.
Brian and I were in a class in 8th grade, world history, and we started studying the war, the Holocaust, and all that had happened. And in most history books in those days, they didn't really cover very much of it. But this teacher really wanted to go above and beyond, apparently. And I had this teacher the year before, and I loved him. He was funny, he was vibrant, he had a great personality. He was huge. He was probably 6'4", weighed maybe 400 pounds, and full of life. And I loved him, and I was so excited that I got him for world history this year. I was like, this is going to be a great class. Well, lo and behold, somewhere before we really got into this World War II, he went around and asked everybody what religion they were, Catholic, Christian, Jewish, whatever. And I remember saying I was Jewish, and maybe he called out, "Are there any Jews?" And I raised my hand, and then I looked over, and Brian had raised his hand. And so instantly I was like, cool, brother from another mother, there's my buddy, And I kind of knew Brian, but we weren't like super great friends or anything. But so this was kind of like this really cool common bond. Well, flash forward a little bit. the teacher starts, his jet black hair. He starts shaving his mustache a little bit more and a little bit more. And he wasn't full Hitler mustache, but he was pretty close to it. And he shaved his head really, real tight, but he had the big hair on the top, just like Adolf Hitler. And he looked about as close as Adolf as you could possibly get without like really people going, oh my God, you look like Adolf Hitler. I knew what he was doing. It was very obvious. And so again, he takes it above and beyond. And besides reading from the textbook, he decides to bring in his personal copy, and he made it very apparent to us that this was one of his most prized possessions, was a copy of Mein Kampf. And knowing this teacher, he probably had it autographed. I'm not kidding you. This is how sick this guy was. So he starts reading to this. Now, unbeknownst to me, and probably most of the kids in this class, he spoke and read fluent German. He was of German descent and was very German, and I had no idea. And he starts reading from this book, and he's reading in German, and then he would translate to English. And he got very, very passionate as he was reading this. And he would come to my desk, and he would slam his hand down on the desk and scream, "Damn Jews, kill the Jews," and scare the living daylights out of me. And then he would go over and do it to Brian. He didn't do it to any of the other children. And the other kids in the class were laughing because they thought he was joking around.
That was the time of my life where I started to realize that people that had this negative thing about something for being Jewish.
Right. Walking down the aisle, and there was another black gentleman coming toward me, and we looked at each other and said, "What's up?" He goes, "What's up?" And we passed each other. We're about 15 yards past him. Mike taps me on the shoulder. He goes, "Where do you know him from?" I started listening to, and at the time, that's when a lot of hardcore rap was coming out, and groups like NWA and Public Enemy, and they really had a strong, what they would call a positive black message in a lot of their songs.
And they started to proceed to tell me how I was going to hell because I was Jewish. So I would tell them jokingly, I said, I just worship Mulu. I think that's what it was. Because I just didn't even want to associate with religion at that point.
Lakers versus Celtics. And not only was that a Magic versus Bird thing, there were so many sub-levels to that, because Magic being the black guy from the city,
Yeah.
and Larry Bird being the self-proclaimed hick from French Lit.